Also, as you know, this and every edition of Bang the Book Radio is presented by DSI Sportsbook. You head on over to DSI, use the promo code BTB and the number 25. You'll get a $25 free bet just for signing up. 100% deposit match bonus for the sportsbook. 100% deposit match bonus for the live casino as well. At BetDSI, it's only a game until you bet it. Two guests coming your way here today. The first, Mr. Bryan Leonard from WagerTalk.com. Bryan, how's it going today, man?
Good morning. Glad to be here for the full show this week.
I'm glad to have you here for the full show this week. Before we get into the college football and the NFL stuff that I wanted to talk about with you, I know you mentioned when we were talking off the air here before recording started, yesterday we talked with Cheetah about the NBA, talked about some betting angles, some observations that he's seen so far, and I know you had one that you wanted to throw out there for our listeners on today's show.
Yeah, I did. Obviously, being from Cleveland, I watch the Cavaliers play every game. And even though they're 3-1 on the season, obviously they're having some major problems figuring out who's going to play where. Every day they're changing their lineups. And other than the first game against Boston, even though they've been favored in every game, they've been outscored in the first period. They did have one game where they tied the opposition. But in that Boston game in which they actually outscored the opposition, that was when Gordon Hayward broke his ankle. So that was obviously a major shock to Boston in that first period. And we saw how Boston was able to come back and cover that line as the game went on. But right now you can make some good money, I think, fading Cleveland early on because they don't really have that rotation going on where other teams do. For example, tonight they're playing Brooklyn, and they're about a 7.5-point favorite. So they're probably laying, 2, maybe even 2.5 points for the first quarter. And it would be a nice way to add to your bankroll by looking to fade that right now. As I said, they really don't know what they're doing yet. What they're trying to do is get a bunch of guys together and change the lineup until they find something that works. Well, that works good in game because when they find something that works, they go on a nice run, and they did that yesterday even against Chicago. But this is a team coming out of the gate that they're not used to playing with each other. And we're able to take advantage of that in the first period. And because the Cavs are so good, you're normally getting extra points by doing that. So I'll be on Brooklyn today in the first quarter, and something to keep an eye on.
No, I think it's a really excellent point. Derrick Rose already hurt with an ankle injury. He's downplayed it, said it's not a big deal. But you've got Dwayne Wade, you've got Jose Calderon. Of course, they're waiting on Isaiah Thomas until about the midpoint of the season. Jay Crowder being worked in, Jeff Green. There are a lot of new guys here on this Cavaliers team, and the reason they're 3-1 is because LeBron is the best player on the planet, and he's able to overcome pretty much everything. But like you said, there's not a whole lot of continuity here really on either end of the floor. So Cavaliers, we know what perception is on them. We know how it follows them around. Even when they do get back to full health here, when Derrick Rose comes back around, this looks like one of those situations where the Cavs are a team that I just wouldn't touch with big numbers.
Yeah, especially early on until they figure out what's going on. And not only are they playing different players, they're playing different positions. Kevin Love started at center the last few games. Now Thompson came back at center and he moved to power forward. LeBron actually played point guard last night because they really had nobody else with some of the injuries that they've had. So it's a work in progress in Cleveland, and they're winning because they are good players, and they've done it for a long time, but they're not looking smooth at all offensively and defensively, and I just sit there and I watch them. And it's similar to what has happened in the past when they brought in these players. It's taken them a while to get going, but once they get going, they're very good. But we can make good money betting against them in certain spots, especially early on in the game before they settle in. And if you're Cleveland, you haven't been playing well, but you've had that ability to turn it up when you need to. And Cleveland's always done that. They've been great in the third quarter, especially defensively. If they're in a tight game in the fourth quarter, they clamp down defensively. It's just something that they could turn on the switch. Well, there's no urgency to turn on a switch in the first quarter of a game, so I think that's where we can make our best shot at making money against them.
All right, let's get into some college football stuff here. And before we look at Week 9, and we've got some MAC games that we're going to talk about here, MACtion starts up in Week 10 here, and we've got one of the worst ideas I've ever seen with Miami of Ohio taking on Ohio in Athens on Halloween. For those that don't know, OU has one of the biggest Halloween parties I've ever seen. It is a massive blowout. It is a very interesting atmosphere, to say the least, and they're going to try and have a college football game on campus here during that. Also, Bowling Green and Kent State coming up next Tuesday. So we've got those Tuesday, Wednesday games coming up here in Week 10, Brian, and I know that we're not going to dive deep into them. We don't even have numbers out for them yet. But what I do want to ask you about here is, with this midweek action, does that change your handicapping strategy at all?
It does, as long as the game is nationally televised. Since a lot of these teams don't get much props from outside the MAC community, the home games that are nationally televised obviously mean a lot more to them. You find that in the Sun Belt also. Your home teams have not played well all season long. All of a sudden they get a chance to be on national TV and they really show up. The crowds get excited, and it's something that we've seen for years. And I know following the MAC, we see a lot of teams coming into MAC territory from out of conference, and they really have a tough time winning these games straight up. And the MAC pulls off some stunning upsets over the years. So keep in mind that your MAC normally isn't that big of a adjustment. A lot of these teams travel by bus to each other's school. They're pretty close actually in most of them, and so your home field advantage isn't as big. But when you get a chance to play a night game on national television, and I've always talked about playing night games, and we've seen that before, and I've bitched about LSU trading away their games just to get TV money, where they got a chance to win more games if they played them at night, because just the crowds are crazy, and that's the way it is. It's a college atmosphere. Anytime these teams that are normally playing on a Saturday afternoon get a chance to play on a night, the kids are going to be fired up, and there's going to be tailgating before the games, and it's much more of a home field advantage for those teams in those situations.
And I think, too, another thing is that, we see some short rest games here when you get these weeknight games. Sometimes the team will play Wednesday, Tuesday. Sometimes the team will play Tuesday, Wednesday. So maybe there's a little bit of extra rest as well. So this is something where you want to do a little bit of research on some of these coaches here in the MAC, and also these injury situations, of course, as well. But see, if teams are on a little bit of a short week, if they've got a little bit of extra rest, a little bit of extra travel time, those are things that can be a pretty big factor here with these weeknight games. We'll talk a little bit more about at least those Wednesday games on next week's show. But, Brian, let's go ahead and look at this Week 9 card in the MAC. Only 3 games here because you've got several teams playing Tuesday and Wednesday of next week. We'll start with game 103-104 on the board for Thursday night. That's Toledo taking on Ball State. Toledo laying 24.5 or 25 on the road here against a Ball State team just destroyed by injury right now, particularly on offense.
They really are, and before the injuries, my line on this would probably be about 16. And Toledo came out at 23, and I said, even at 23, I couldn't take Ball State. Now the line's gone up. I even see a 25.5 and it's a win here in Vegas. And Toledo's one of those teams over the years that has beaten up on some pretty bad teams. Right now, Ball State is a bad team. Ball State's only got the one win, and that was against UAB week 2. That was their only FBS win. If they were to play UAB now, they obviously would be an underdog. And they were actually a 14-point favorite in that game, and I think UAB would be favored over them pretty substantially at this point. But you got a Ball State team that just got crushed at homecoming against Central Michigan last week, 56-9. The 2 weeks before that, they lose to Akron 31-3, and Western Michigan 55-3. So it's been a while since this Ball State team has looked good at all. And now they're playing the best team in the MAC here, and then they play Eastern Michigan and Northern Illinois, Buffalo, all on Thursdays, Miami on a Tuesday. So it's all midweek games the rest of the season for Ball State. Toledo's a team that, we talked about, and interesting for Toledo, they've had 6 drives starting in opponent territory this year. They have not allowed a single opponent to start a drive in their own territory, and that's part of the reason why they're 5-1 FBS and 3-3 ATS. But this is a team in Toledo the last 2 weeks. The defense has really been good in the first half. 3.8 yards per play against Akron, 2.0 against Central, and that was the same Central that just crushed Ball State last week. So my numbers say you should play Ball State, but I'm not. Sometimes you just got to sit back from the numbers and say, well, they've just got too many injuries at this point, and why would Ball State get excited to play this game. They've gotten crushed 3 weeks in a row. Now they're playing a team that can actually beat them even more. The only thing they can think about here is that Toledo has Northern Illinois on deck, and Northern Illinois has been one of those teams that has been battling with Toledo over the years for the conference title here. So Northern Illinois and Ohio on deck for Toledo. So we could see a letdown, but once again, this is a game that's going to be on national TV, the CBS Sports Network. So we'll have to see what happens. But even though my number says Ball State, I can't stand in front of this Toledo team.
Well, and here's a really big point to make about this game, and this is something that's very important for our listeners out there because we've got 3 or 4 conference games for pretty much everybody out there in the country now. When you look at Toledo's full body of work this year, they've given up 26.6 points per game, 5.8 yards per play. But in conference play, they've given up 15.3 points per game and just 4.9 yards per play. So they've shaved off quite a bit from that yards per play that they had on the season. And early on in the year, they played Nevada. They played that air raid, lots of throws. You're going to give up yards in an air raid, even if it's not the most efficient air raid. In terms of a yards per play standpoint, you're going to give up some yards. They played Tulsa, gave up 51 points in that game. Played Miami, gave up 52 points in that game. So if you're comparing this Toledo defense with the full body of work, you're doing yourself a major disservice because in conference play, as we've seen already here so far, they're going to be a much better unit than the stats would show.
Yeah, you definitely have to separate the conference from non-conference. A lot of these coaches don't even care about the non-conference, especially in the Sun Belt. These guys just take paychecks and leave and hope their players don't get injured. So you always got to take a look at how they do a concert or conference and outside the conference. And, it just goes to show you, and we've talked about this earlier, that when Toledo's got the conference, they played much better. Well, it just goes to show you that this MAC conference as a whole is down this year. Even though Toledo's the best team, I think they're down from years past. So, and then Western Michigan's not the same, obviously, since the coaching change. And Northern Illinois played better than I thought they have, but I thought they should. But they're nothing special. Ohio's nothing special. So this is a MAC conference that's down this year, and you've got one team that's good. You've got probably 4 teams that are pretty good, and then you've got the rest of the league. And that's when you can make some money, is when the rest of the league is playing each other and teams are put into a favorite role where they shouldn't be because they don't know how to win the games, and that's where we can make our money in the MAC this year.
Speaking of Western Michigan here, they don't play until Wednesday, November 1st, so we won't talk about them on this show. We'll talk about them next week. But their quarterback, John Wasink, broken collarbone for him. I think he's out for the rest of the regular season at least, and then possibly on into a bowl game, which they should make. But that's a pretty big loss for Western Michigan because he was actually playing pretty well. 14-4 touchdown-interception ratio, 64% completion percentage, but he's out now, so make sure that you adjust your Western Michigan power rating accordingly. Speaking of those directional Michigan schools, let's talk about one here with Eastern Michigan. They're on the road to take on Northern Illinois. Number opened 8. It's now down to 7. This is game 107-108 on the board. Both of these teams 5-2 against the number here this year. The difference is Northern Illinois is also 5-2 straight up, whereas Eastern Michigan 2-5 straight up. But they've lost all of their games here this season by 7 points or less. And then they were getting 8 at the open for this game. Something doesn't add up here, Brian.
Yeah, I'm really impressed by the way these two defenses have played. We're getting a total in the 47 range. Yeah, I guess I could see that. Maybe a little bit lower. But you've got a Northern Illinois team who, obviously it was a different time of the year, but they only allowed 23 points to Boston College. Boston College right now looks like they finally got that offense running. Tried speeding it up a little bit this year, and it's starting to work well for them. They only allowed 17 points to Nebraska, and that was at Nebraska. Nebraska is not the greatest team in the world, but anytime you can hold Nebraska on their home field to 17 points is pretty impressive. They did lose that game to San Diego State, allowing 34, but the last 3 weeks they allowed 3 to Kent, which I believe is normal for Kent. Anytime they play anybody, they score 3 points. That's about all you can expect. But they go to Buffalo and only allow 13, and Bowling Green only allow 17. So this Northern Illinois defense is keeping teams out of the end zone. It's been pretty impressive, especially the last 4 weeks. They've allowed 4 drives to start in their own area, and they're still holding the opposition down. So Northern Illinois defense is probably the best unit on the field this week. But Eastern Michigan, you look over what they've done this year, they haven't allowed more than 28 points in any game. That was against Army just a couple of games ago. They even held Toledo to 20, Kentucky to 24. Kentucky's down this year back to where they normally are, but to hold Toledo at Toledo to only 20, Western Michigan 17 in regulation, Ohio 13 in regulation. These are two very good defenses here. And as you pointed out, when you're getting a full touchdown in a low total game, that's something you want to keep an eye on. This is a game that it could go either way, and turnovers could make the difference. Last year, Eastern loses at home against Northern Illinois in overtime, so that one goes to overtime. And they've had some close encounters the last few years. Right now, the under may be the way to go here, or some way to play maybe Eastern Michigan plus a 7 in a game, a little bit on the plus 4, whatever, 4.5 maybe in the first half. There are ways to attack this one because we're going to be looking to play the dog here, getting the points.
Yeah, Northern Illinois, big thing for their defense this year, 17 takeaways, but they have given the ball up 15 times. So they have 17 takeaways, but they're only +2 in turnover margin this year, which is pretty hard to do when you're 8th in the country in takeaways. But for Eastern Michigan here, I mean, at some point you kind of wonder when this team actually breaks. They've done a lot of bending this year. Like I said, their last 5 losses, all of them in a row, by 7 points or less. You lose an emotional game at Toledo where you got a chance to knock off one of the best teams in the conference. That comes a week after you lose at Kentucky when you were very much in that game against an SEC team. Lose by a point to an option team on the road. Come back and lose to a division rival in Western Michigan in overtime. Now a short week at Northern Illinois. So I think that's why the number came out where it did, because from a spot standpoint, this is pretty brutal for Eastern Michigan. But again, I mean, this is a team that has been right there, and they've been right there in terms of coming close to upsets. They've been a dog in 4 of these games that they've lost here out of their last 5. But, I kind of wonder to myself, because Eastern Michigan, one of the biggest problems that Chris Creighton had with this team was that it just didn't have a whole lot of depth. And he's done a good job of building that up. But at some point, you kind of got to ask yourself, okay, all these close losses, all these emotional games, all this frustration, do they just get trucked at some point?
It's a possibility, but to know when that's going to happen, it's easier said than done. I know we're going to talk about the Buffalo game in a minute, and Buffalo had that big 7 overtime game, and the next week everybody thought that they were going to lay flat against Northern Illinois, played them really well. And then last week, I think it came into effect. They made a quarterback change because of injury, and they lose that game to Miami, Ohio. So that may have been a letdown from that. So you never really know when it's all going to fall apart for a team. But until it happens, you've got to give them all the credit in the world. And you can expect something to happen. And, maybe that's a game that if you see it happen, it's a game you do some live betting on if you're able to do that and make some adjustments that way. But going into the games, I would expect Eastern Michigan to have a nice game this week. We'll see what happens once the game starts.
All right, let's go to that game, Buffalo and Akron, game 123, 124 on the board. Not everybody has a line out for this one. Seems like we're kind of waiting a little bit on the Buffalo quarterback position to see who they're going to go with, although I think Kyle Van Treese is going to be the guy here again this week with the injury problems that they have. But we talked about Akron last week, and we talked about their game heading into taking on Toledo. And Akron was 3-0 in the MAC, wins over Bowling Green on the road and Western Michigan on the road in that game that was pushed back a day because the field flooded. And I was kind of wondering to myself, okay, how legit is this Akron team? How for real is this Akron team? Well, last week they lose at Toledo 48-21. So is this an indication of what Akron may actually be? Or was that just one of those outlier games where it was a really bad spot for the Zips?
I think it's what Akron is. If you go back and look at what they've done, when they played elite opponents, Penn State, they lose 52-0. Iowa State, 41-14. Toledo, 48-21. Not elite, but very good. And then when you take a look at the other teams that they played, Troy, Bowling Green, Ball State, and Western Michigan, they were in each one of those games, winning 3 of them, and they gave Troy all they could handle off of that game for Troy. So I think Akron is good when they're not outclassed for the players on the team. They're good. They're well coached when they play teams that are equal to them in talent, but when they have to step up, they just haven't been very good. And Buffalo is one of those teams. It's similar to Akron. I made this line probably 2.5 here, so I'm leaning with Buffalo slightly, but it all depends on who the quarterback is here. The line's coming out now. We're starting to see 3s, 3.5s, which tell me that Buffalo will be with the backup quarterback this week. So that's only a point or two differential from what they would be with the starters. So, but Buffalo's defense has been very good. In regulation this year, they allowed 31 to Florida Atlantic and 31 to Western Michigan, but for the most part, they've held everybody in the 13 to 24 range. So the Buffalo defense is very good. And the Akron defense has struggled when I said, like I say, when they play in an elite offense or a top of the line offense, but they've allowed 23 or less to everybody else. So, the line currently is at 48, slightly to the under. But, I much prefer Akron when they're playing a team that they can compete with as opposed to a team that they just don't have the skill position players and the ability to match some of these higher-scoring offenses. But I don't think we'll see that with Buffalo here. Buffalo scored the 31 against Western Michigan, 34 against Florida Atlantic, but overall they're scoring in the 20s. So, the line's not high enough for me to jump on Buffalo here, but I expect this one to be a lower-scoring game.
Yeah, I've got this game lined at 2.5 as well, and I thought about heading down to this one, but I'm too old to drink enough by 11:30 in the morning to make it worthwhile, so I won't be attending this one. But that is another interesting element to this game, is that this is an 11:30 start time. Normally you get the 12 or the 12:30. Usually the MAC plays a lot of afternoon games, whether it's noon or 3:30. Sometimes they'll play like a 2 o'clock start, something like that. So maybe that gives a little bit more credence to your under play here, Brian, maybe even in the first half, with this game starting here at 11:30 in the morning. We'll see if these teams are able to get off the mat very early on. Let's backtrack in terms of rotation order here, and let's talk a little bit of Big Ten for a second. Nebraska and Purdue. This is game 117, 118 on the board. Purdue either a 5 or 5.5 point favorite, depending on where you look out there. And, Brian, the reason I wanted to talk about this game with you is that Purdue has been a pretty impressive team here this year. I mean, Jeff Brom is doing an outstanding job with this program. He's doing a great job of turning things around. On the other side, you've got this Nebraska team in a state of flux, a lot of uncertainty. There's an athletic director change, which means Mike Riley is probably not going to be your head coach next year. But what I really am intrigued about from a handicapping standpoint is last week is really the first time that we saw Purdue with some significant expectations. They were on the road against Rutgers as a 7.5 point favorite. We don't see Purdue as more than a touchdown favorite at home, let alone on the road. But they were last week, and they lost outright. So does that have any carryover effect to you here into this week against the Nebraska team off a bye?
It possibly could, but keep in mind they played a physical Wisconsin team the week before out on the road. So coming back off of that, and Minnesota was pretty physical also the week before that. So I ended up betting Rutgers last week, and it was a good bet for me. But Purdue's 5-2 against the spread, losing against Michigan and Rutgers, and the Michigan game was the game that it was the prove-em game for Purdue, and they really didn't. They looked good at the half, but then in the second half, they just couldn't get that offense going against that Michigan defense. Last week against Rutgers, they scored 3 points in the first half. The 2 weeks before that, they scored 6 and 6 against Minnesota and Wisconsin. They've been slow starting. They haven't looked really good until they played Missouri and Ohio back on the second and third week. They surprised those teams, but the offense hasn't been nearly as good as what we were expecting early on for Purdue. And this Nebraska team, as you pointed out, a lot of negativity at this Nebraska team. The coach is probably on his way out. He's been here for 3 years. He's coming off of a bye, which you would think would help Nebraska. But then once again, if the coach doesn't think he's going to be there anymore, are the kids really going to listen to him when they're on their bye, or are they just taking that week off and saying, okay, this is a chance to just relax a little bit and get away from it, or are they sitting there putting in new plays and trying to better themselves? They finished the season with a decent slate. They played Purdue, Northwestern, and Minnesota the next 3 weeks. it's possible they could win those games, and then they finish off with Penn State and Iowa. Not sure they win either one of those, but I think this is a telling game for Nebraska when they play Purdue this week. If they don't show here, it's probably a team you can write off for the rest of the season because, even though a couple of years ago they were only 6-7, they were 9-4 last year, and they had 9 wins the last 5 or 6 years before that. So this is a team, even though they're not as good as they used to be, they're still a team that expects to win. And this year your wins are against Rutgers, Illinois, and Arkansas State. Not too impressive. So we'll have to see. But I've got major concerns about Nebraska. I won't be on that. My line here was 6, so it's right where the line is. I won't be on Nebraska, but I think this is a telling game for Nebraska fans.
My line is 6 on this one here, too. And for Nebraska, they got to go 3-2 over these final 5 games to make it to a bowl. And I don't know if that's going to happen. And they certainly need to get this one if they want to give themselves a really good shot at that. Although Minnesota kind of falling off a little bit here late in the year, they're not going to win that game at Penn State. They may need that Iowa game to get to a bowl game. And, we'll kind of have to reassess and reevaluate their motivation at that point with, as we talked about a little bit already, what is probably a lame duck head coach there in Lincoln. All right, let's flip over to the NFL side here for a few minutes, and then let's talk about a couple of games where we've seen some pretty interesting line moves here on the underdogs. We'll start with game 255, 256. The Atlanta Falcons take on the New York Jets. Atlanta Falcons took heavy steam last week against New England in that Super Bowl rematch. The fog may have played a factor, but they still didn't look very good in that game. Now they're back on the road again, this time at the Meadowlands. This number opened 4.5, It's down to 4 pretty much everywhere across the market. Couple 4.5s, 5 dimes, one of them, Bovada, obviously a very public book at 4.5 minus 15 on the Falcons. When you look at this Atlanta team, when you look at this Jets team, it's been a big surprise here this year. Does this line move surprise you?
Not really. I'm looking at my screen and I'm seeing 5.5s at the local books here that are more for the sharps, and the wise guy books are sitting at 4. So the money's coming in on the Jets here from the wise guys. So and I don't blame them. The Falcons really have not. This offense has been really struggling. There's Warren Sharp does a great job with the NFL, and he sent out some charts that he has made, and he's dedicated the week to talking about this Atlanta offense, and a lot of great information there if you want to look him up, Warren Sharp on Twitter, and follow him. He's a great follow. But he talks about this Atlanta offense, and obviously it was a different coaching staff last year than this year, but last year they were just so dominant. They would come out and just try to put as many points on, shock and awe in the first half, and make you go out of your game plan and try to come back on them. And Gase is gone, and it hasn't worked in San Francisco that way, but he had the personnel in Atlanta, and this year's Atlanta's team is just, it's not the same. And they've only scored over 20 points once, and that was in that Green Bay game. That was in the first half of that game. So last week was the first time they've actually been outscored in the first half, 17-0 for New England. But this is a team that's not nearly as explosive offensively as they have been in the past. The Jets are a team, we go back and look at them on the season, they've held their own. They played pretty well. They haven't looked good in doing it, but the players are coming out and the players are playing hard. And you've got one team coming off a Super Bowl loss that has not lived up to what they expected, and you got another team that nobody gave them any credit at all, and they're in every game that they play. Other than that game at Oakland when they lose 45-20, they've been in every single game. They go to overtime against Jacksonville, who's turned out to be a pretty good team, and they actually win that game. They only lose by 7 at New England in a controversial call. Miami, they're able to split with Miami. The Jets team is one of those teams, you find this very often, where a team outplays their ability. And the Jets are doing that. And anytime you can catch a team playing at home, getting key numbers of 3 and 4, that's something you have to take a look at, especially against a team who is really coming off of a game that they really wanted against New England. This is the second of 3 straight. They've got Carolina on deck, at the divisional opponent on the road, so they're playing 3 straight games on the road. You would think that Atlanta wants this game over the Jets because this is a very important game, but the next week is more important because it's a conference affiliate, and they've got Dallas and Seattle on deck. So we'll have to see what happens here, but it doesn't surprise me at all that the Jets are getting the money.
Yeah, I'll be really curious to see what happens with Jets lines going forward. They've got a short week division game against Buffalo coming up on November 2nd, and you have to expect at some point that the Jets probably regress to what they're supposed to be. I mean, they are a big overachiever right now. They're sitting out there at 3-4. Some people didn't even think they'd win 3 games all season. At some point they may regress back into what they're supposed to be, and when that happens, I think it's going to be very noticeable, and people are going to look to fade the Jets. But like you said, right now, from an effort standpoint, this is a team that's going out there and giving a lot of it. Let's talk about another team here in the AFC East. That's the Buffalo Bills, who are now down to a 2.5-point favorite at home against the Oakland Raiders. In fact, DSI, the first book out there on the offshore market, to jump down to Buffalo -2 with -15 on the juice there in that one. So you got the Raiders, long travel, off a division game, albeit on Thursday night against the Kansas City Chiefs, which they did win, and they're they're not a road favorite, but they're getting closer to a road pick'em here against a Buffalo defense that's been very, very good. Is this one a move that surprises you?
Somewhat. I don't see the love for the Raiders here. They did win that game against Kansas City, but they weren't the better team that day. Kansas City was the better team. They've gone on the road. They lost to Denver by 6. They go on the road. They lose to Washington by 17. They did beat Tennessee in that opener, but Oakland does have the scheduling edge here because they did play on Thursday and they travel to Buffalo playing on Sunday. Keep in mind, Buffalo has to take on the division rival Jets on Thursday, so it's a short week ahead for Buffalo. They're playing a team that's not a division rival, so they don't know as much about Oakland as they would be their divisional rivals, but they've got that game coming up with the Jets, and since the Jets have gotten off to such a nice start, Buffalo can't overlook the Jets. So that may be a tough turnaround for them when they go to play the Jets, but Buffalo's, to me, the better team here, and laying less than 3 is the way that I would go here. That Buffalo defense, as you pointed out, they did allow 27 to Tampa Bay last week, but that's the most they've allowed all season, holding everybody else to 20 or less. This is a Buffalo team that they started going back to the McCoy at running back. He had some success last week. I would consider that something to happen again here against Oakland. And, keep in mind, Oakland's still got a quarterback that's a little bit beat up here. And, the Buffalo quarterback is gaining more confidence week in and week out. You can just tell it by watching. He's able to run, pick his spots to run. And this Buffalo offense, they scored 30 last week, and they're starting to play a little bit better. I kind of like this Buffalo team right now. And, if New England wouldn't have grabbed a couple of those wins that they shouldn't have gotten, maybe we could have played on Buffalo to win this division, but it's a pretty good payback. But, I think the line's a little bit short. I expected this to be a solid 3, maybe even 3 with juice on Buffalo.
Let me play a little bit of devil's advocate here in this game and look at the Bills and point out that, people talk about how great this defense is. This defense has given up 5.2 yards per play this season. They only gained 4.7 yards per play. So they're minus 0.5 yards per play in that department. And they're plus 10 in turnover margin right now. 13 takeaways, only 3 giveaways. So when I see numbers like that, I kind of expect some regression to the mean there. And maybe that's the reason why the number's moving the way that it is.
It could be. And you talked about the Buffalo getting a little bit lucky. Well, they haven't had an opponent started driving their territory all season long, which is a rarity. So they've been very lucky in that regard. So I still think Buffalo's the better team here. I'm not a Raiders believer. The Raiders have just played 2 divisional rivals, and now they got Buffalo and Miami before their bye. Like I said, I thought it should be 3, slightly higher than that. So it's probably not a game I'm going to get involved in, but I like the way this Buffalo team is trending.
And, of course, the Raiders, they were a team that coming into the season a lot of people didn't really believe in, and they haven't done a whole lot to change that narrative at all here. Minus 0.3 yards per play. They only have 5 takeaways on the season, and they're all fumble recoveries. They don't even have an interception yet this year. Of course, Buffalo doesn't turn the football over, so It should be a pretty interesting one to watch there, especially from a turnover luck standpoint, to see which team has the better end of that. But Bryan Leonard from WagerTalk.com. What's going on over there right now, Brian?
Just putting my plays up on Wager Talk. I've got a nice play going tomorrow in college football. I also put up a strong play in Monday Night Football this week. I'm not one of those guys that puts up a play just because it's on TV and trying to make sales, so it's probably only my second or third Monday Night Football play all season long, but it's a nice play for me, so I've got that up early. Not sure how long this line is going to stay where it is, so we've got that up there right now, and it comes with a 150% guarantee. If the game doesn't cover, you get 150% of the money you spent on it back into your gambling account over there. And looking forward to a real big weekend. College has been a struggle, as I pointed out last week, but the NFL, I did have Green Bay last week, but other than that, NFL is going great. Second half plays 2-0 again in the NFL last week. So NFL has been good for us so far this year, and hopefully we can continue that.
And you can follow Brian on Twitter at @BLeonardSports. Bryan Leonard, thank you so much for your time, man. We appreciate it. We'll talk to you again next week, bud.
Sounds great. Best of luck to everyone.